Okay, let's get into the message, and we continue today with the book of 1 Timothy. 2 Sundays ago, Neil spoke on chapter 4, and today we're going into chapter 5. Unfortunately, 2 Sundays ago we had technical issues, so we had no recording of the message. I wasn't able to review it in specific terms of how Neil navigated chapter 4. But so I just glanced through it myself, and chapter 4 is a chapter that starts warning against false teaching, telling Timothy and those under his care, his leadership, what to avoid, what not to do, and then Paul kind of switches gear, and Paul then talks about the opposite, what to do, what to aim for. He's talking about godliness and how one becomes more godly, what it looks like, and its benefits. And at the end of chapter 4, it ends with some very personal words of Paul to Timothy, exhortations and instructions to enhance, to optimize and strengthen Timothy's influence in and leadership of the church. So the end of chapter 4 ends very tightly, narrowly, kind of zoomed in on, focused in on Timothy personally. And then in chapter 5, Paul kind of zooms out again, and he's widens the angle of his view and his perspective, and he addresses matters in chapter 5 that pertain to the church, the whole church, the life of the church, related to how people are to be treated in the church. And so he begins by addressing Timothy, and through Timothy he's addressing, of course, the whole church that Timothy was leading, and he's addressing us, right? God's word is for all of us, and instructions to Timothy are instructions to us. So let's just read the first two verses of Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Hear Paul's words to Timothy, Timothy chapter 5. He says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with all purity." With all purity. So Paul first addresses the whole matter of how we treat people. How we treat people, because for a leader, for any believer, in fact, how we treat people is everything. How we treat people says it all. That directly reflects the state of our relationship with God. It reveals the health, it reveals the genuineness, it reveals the authenticity of our relationship with God, how we treat people. How we treat people. John writes in 1 John 4, 20, 21, if someone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. John makes the direct link and connection between our relationship with our brother, our fellow church member, and our relationship with God, saying we cannot claim to love God, meanwhile not love or mistreat people, our brother. Our relationship with God is inextricably linked with our relationship with our brother, with our fellow church member. They cannot be separated. Loving God is loving others. Loving God is loving his people, and beyond his people, those who are not his people as well. Paul tells Timothy in specific terms what that looks like when relating to certain groups of people in the church. Older men, older women, younger women. And what he says reflects the fact that whoever we are in the church, remember Timothy was the leader, he was the pastor, but whoever we are in the church, in all our conduct, in all our interactions, we must remember, we must keep uppermost in our minds the fact that the church is not primarily an organization, it's not primarily a business, it's not primarily a club, it's not the army, it's first and foremost a family. It's a family. And so Paul uses familial terms in telling Timothy how to relate to older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters. Expanding just in my own words what Paul, I feel, was saying to Timothy, something like this comes to my mind. He's saying this, as a leader, Timothy, don't exercise your authority in an authoritarian, in an overbearing, in a harsh, in a dictatorial way. Don't do that, Timothy. That's not how to lead. Rather, treat those you lead them, win them over, influence them by demonstrating genuine care, concern, love, respect, honor. Remember, Timothy, you're not an army sergeant. This is not your military platoon. It's your family you're leading. It's your family. Show them that. Treat them in a way that reflects that. Timothy, above all, love your people well. Love your people well. That's the way to effectively lead and influence them. That's what I sense is coming from Paul's heart. In reflecting on how we relate to and treat people and our relationship with God, I was reminded of what the Bible says specifically about how we treat the poor. The poor. That how we treat the poor reflects on how we treat God. Because as my research showed me, God identifies with the poor. Jesus himself stated that whatever you did to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Proverbs 14:31 says, he who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, for God. But whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Proverbs 19:17, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay them for what they have done. How we treat the poor is how we treat God. That's what it tells us. But that has a wider, a more general truth to it. Something I often think about is when Paul was on the road to Damascus, going there to persecute the church, he was arrested, he was stopped, he was apprehended by Jesus, who said to him, why are you persecuting me? Is what Jesus said to him. Not the church, he said me. Jesus so identifies with his followers that how we treat them is how we treat him. Is how we treat him. And so Jesus told Paul, how you're treating these Christians is how you're treating me. Persecuting them is persecuting me. Remember, how we treat others is how we treat God. How we relate to them is how we relate to God. Our treatment of people, how in general we relate to them, is one of the true markers. It's one of the true measures of how we treat God, of the health of our relationship with God. For what it's worth, in my walk as a believer, in my limited experience in Christian leadership, two things have come to stand out for me, have risen to the top. Two things draw me to a leader. Two things, for me, as I say, have just become particularly, for me, important. In terms of character traits that draw me to a leader, that want me to be influenced by this leader, that make me want to follow this leader. The first is that the leader is a humble person. Is a humble person. And the second is, and the word that comes to mind, is that they are gracious. They are gracious. They are gracious people. Leaders, people who treat other people well. Well. Especially those who oppose them. That they're gracious to those people. The people who cause them grief, the people who disagree with them, that they're gracious to those people, even in the face of that. Is this leader in general respectful, honoring, kind, not rude in how they lead people? Again, including those who don't agree with them, who resist them. 1 Corinthians 13 says, love is not rude. Love is not rude. And love should not be rude in the face of those who agree with us and follow us, and those who don't, who may choose to separate from us, who may choose to go their own way, who may choose to go elsewhere, whatever. Paul talks about this specifically in 2 Timothy. He addresses this area of conduct for a leader in this context, addressing specifically how a leader should treat people, including those who oppose him. 2 Timothy 2, 24-25, and a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient, in humility, correcting those who are in opposition. In humility, correcting those who are in opposition. You know, when people come against us, that's when our humility really gets tested, doesn't it? In humility, correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance, so they may know the truth. You know, as I just reflected this on general, and how leaders treat people, I was reminded of comments I've heard over the years about two high-profile leaders in the church, whose leadership suffered and was called into question. And one of them, their church just was wiped out. And from what I remember being said, the impression I was left with was, amongst other things, those leaders just simply did not treat people well. Just simply did not treat people well. They were harsh. They were disrespectful. They were not honoring of people, of those they led, those entrusted to their care. Leaders have influence. Leaders have power, and they can easily abuse it. They can easily abuse it. And it's a very ugly thing when they do, especially in the church. Especially in the church. When leaders in the church become abusive, treating people harshly, manipulating and controlling those who God has given them to lead, using and abusing them rather than caring for them. It's a sad, sad thing. And talking of that sort of thing, related to one of these groups of people that Paul mentions, in one of these groups of people that Paul mentioned, there's 4 of them, older men and older women, younger men and younger women. Into one of these groups, Paul mentions something specifically to Timothy. A pitfall that Timothy must guard against. A particular character quality he must hold on to tightly. He says to Timothy, treat younger women as sisters with all purity. With all purity. If there is anything we see time and time again taking leaders down, it's them failing to heed this warning of Paul's to Timothy. These words, this directive, conduct yourself, Timothy, not just with purity, with all purity. With all purity. Ignoring that, not taking that seriously, makes such a mess of a leader, makes such a mess of the church, makes such a mess of the church's witness. For that matter, it makes such a mess of anyone, of anyone's life. Paul again doesn't say to Timothy, treat younger women with purity. He says with all purity. With all purity. He is really black and white on this. In other words, Paul is telling us, and excuse the pun, this is not an issue to flirt with. Purity. It is not an issue to flirt with. It is not an issue to play loose with. For a leader or for anybody. As we say in England, if you give impurity an inch, it'll take a mile. If you give it an inch, it'll take a mile. You cannot accommodate impurity just a little bit. Just a little bit. It never stays that way as just a little bit. You accommodate it a little bit, and before you know it, you are drowning in impurity. It's got you by the throat. It's swallowing you up. That's the nature of impurity. That's the nature of sin in general. But this impurity is a particularly flammable sin that can burn you up so fast. Paul is saying to Timothy, Timothy, as a leader in the church, and it's true for anyone, you must have a zero tolerance policy on impurity. Zero tolerance of impurity. From within yourself, from the deepest level of your own being, in your mind, in your thoughts, etc., etc. You cannot allow it. You cannot accommodate it. You cannot entertain it one little bit. If you'll do, you'll very quickly be out of the race. Out of the leadership race, out of the Christian race. You'll be sidelined, you'll be paralyzed, you'll be crippled. To use a term Paul used already earlier in this letter, you'll be shipwrecked if you don't pray really tight on this one. So let's read on. We've done 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. We're going to read through 3 through to 16, verses 3 through to 16. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Here we go. Verse 3, 1 Timothy chapter 5. Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse younger widows. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry their children, manage a house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. This passage is talking about some things that just don't exist in our church these days. But I just want to use this passage to draw some broad, general principles from it. Because although we don't have the specifics, the principles that are still relevant to us are there and are still permanent today, and we still operate the church on those principles. So I want to, as I say, just draw some broad, general principles from this passage, taken from various themes and various matters that it touches on. The primary focus of these verses is widows in the church. Widows in the church, older and younger women who had lost their husbands. At any time in society, in our world, widows, for a number of reasons, are in a weakened position in life. They're vulnerable. They're vulnerable. And that was even more true in Bible times. When women lost their husbands back then, often with that they lost their income. They lost their income, leaving them abandoned, alone, isolated, and lacking the basic necessities of life. And Paul was concerned for these women. He was concerned for these women. So he wrote these instructions to Timothy regarding their care. And the very fact we find a passage like this in the Bible, in the New Testament, is a reminder to us that God has particular concern for the weak, for the poor, for the vulnerable, for the marginalized. It's a theme throughout the Bible. And if he has a concern for those people, so should we. So should we. In studying this passage, I got the impression that Paul is talking here in this passage about two groups of widows. Two groups of widows. And within those two groups, he makes a further division and distinction. First of all, his concern is first of all for all the widows related to the church in general, who were connected to the church, all of them. Because of the impoverished, the unprotected, the unprovided for state that they were in. But then it seems within this group of widows in general, he refers to another group of widows, a smaller kind of subgroup of widows that Paul refers to in verse 9 as the number. The number. He says in verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old enter into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. So who are the number? So back then in the church, when some women were widowed, they committed themselves to stay single so as to devote themselves to the work of the Lord, to serving in the church, to serving its members, and that included teaching the younger women in the church. And these women who served in the church, these widows who served in the church in that way, were supported by the church. So we have widows in general, are talked about in this passage, who need to be provided for. And we have this group of widows who committed themselves to serve in the church, who are also to be provided for. But then Paul draws another line among the widows. He talks twice in the passage about widows who are really widows. Widows who are really widows. So there are widows who are really widows, and in Paul's mind there are widows who are not really widows. What is Paul talking about here? What does he mean by that? Well, that's made clear by Paul in what he writes. It's evident that by widows who are really widows, he means widows who not only have no husband, but also have no other family. Who have no other family, no other means of family support. As opposed to widows who have children or grandchildren or some other relative who can support them, who can provide for them. These widows, Paul in some ways categorizes as what he calls not really widows. Okay, because they have familial support. And in general terms, Paul says widows with family, their family should take care of them. But those without family, with no family, they should be taken care of by the church. And this relates and this touches on another whole subject of church life that Paul has in mind in this passage, and that's very pertinent to us today. And that is the matter of the limited resources of the church and the management of those resources. The limited resources of the church and the management of those resources. If you're a board member, this is a great chapter for you. This is a great chapter for you. It gives principles of instructions on good management of church resources as relevant today as they were when Paul wrote them. A commentary I read said that the early church was generally made up of people from low socioeconomic status and position. So those within it did not have a lot of money, a lot of wealth. Thus, resources to help those in need were limited, were seriously limited. So as the commentary pointed out, Paul was concerned that the limited resources within the church were not overly taxed. That they were managed and stewarded and used well, and used where they were needed most, with efficiency. So in terms of providing for the widows who were poor, that was Paul's concern from the church's side, from the church's point of view, that the church was not overly burdened, providing for situations that could be provided for by another legitimate source, the family. The family. So he says if a widow has children, has grandchildren, a relative of some sort, they should provide for her. But in saying this, Paul was not simply acting like, modern day insurance companies, just trying to pass the buck so they don't have to pay, right? Paul was not just passing the buck on widows to the family so the church didn't have to pay, calling on the family to provide just to take the financial pressure off the church. In what he writes about family taking care of widows, we're reminded that in God's social order, the social structures he has set in motion, he has designed, he has created, there's an institution that plays an even bigger role than the church in providing care, support, love, and provision for individuals, and that is the family. In talk about family caring for widows, this passage reminds us of the God-given obligation, responsibility, privilege we have to love, to serve, to care, and provide for our family's members. Not just the widows, all of our family members. In my reading, it was pointed out that this passage is a reminder to us of the old adage that faith begins at home. Faith begins at home. I made the general comment earlier that our relationship with God is inextricably linked to our relationship with others. We cannot say we love God, we have faith in God, meanwhile we're not loving and caring towards those around us. Our vertical relationship with God cannot be separated and detached from our horizontal relationships with those around us, with others. And at the very front of those people who form the lineup of my relationship with others is my family. My relationships with my family members. If I claim to be a follower of Christ, and I'm not showing Christ at home, his love, his honor, his respect, his care to my family, to my wife, to my children, to my parents, to a widowed parent, whoever it might be, if they're not getting the best of me, if I'm not treating them well, serving them well, sacrificing for them, then there's something wrong. There's something wrong. A disconnect has taken place between my relationship with God and my relationship with others, and the most significant others in my life, my family. And from what Paul wrote in the verses we read, it's clear that that should not happen. That can't happen. I said that this is a good chapter for board members, for those managing the resources of the church. In that regard, it's a good chapter for all of us, because we all have resources, some resources, and we're called to be good stewards of what God has given us, to manage it well, to make the best use of it. And in this chapter, I was reminded of a common tension that we face in making decisions about what God has given us, in giving away what God has given us. I mentioned in the church Timothy led, there was a particular group of older widows. Paul said that to be part of this group, a widow had to be 60 years old or older. And these widows committed themselves not to remarry, so as to devote themselves to the service of God and his people, and they were supported by the church. And Paul refers to this group of women as the number in verse 9. And so for women to be part of this ministering group of women who were supported by the church, first of all, they had to be a widow. They had to be a widow. But Paul told Timothy there was another criteria they had to fulfill. Widows must not be part of the group unless, reading verses 9 and 10, this was true about them. Unless she has been, verse 9 and 10, she has been the wife of one husband, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has loved strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So women were to be added to this group if they were widows and if they were women of good character. If they were women of good character with a good reputation and a good past track record to prove it. Paul says women who qualify in those two ways should be part of this ministering group of widows, being supported by the church so they are freed up to serve in it. So when it came to the church's resources being used to support this particular group of widows, Paul was concerned on two fronts. Number one, that there was a genuine need. Those who were part of this group had to be widows. Otherwise, they didn't need church support. Their husbands could support them. And number two, those widows need to be a good investment of church resources. They need to be these women need to be a worthy cause for the church to give to. Worth the church investing into. Widows who truly would minister to the church effectively as they had committed themselves to do. As opposed to what Paul was concerned would happen if younger widows were allowed into this group of ministering widows. Concerns he lays out in verses 11 and 13. He was concerned in time if younger widows were part of this group, that these younger widows would abandon their commitment to stay single and would soon want to get married. And so their effectiveness to serve the church would be reduced. So they'd want to get married. And then in verse 13, Paul's concern about these younger women gets worse. It gets darker, more grave. He feels they'll become idle. He's afraid they'll become lazy. And as he puts it, they'll wander from house to house. Gossips, busybodies, saying things which they ought not. And so basically, as opposed to devotedly serving and blessing the church, Paul's concerned these younger widows will become a liability to the church. And in all of this, he's saying, don't invest into that. We don't want to be enabling that. That's not good at all. That's not sowing into a worthy cause. That's just supporting and promoting laziness. We don't want church resources used for that. So he says, better the young women marry. The young widows marry. In that they'll be supported. And in that they can pursue their God-given calling to be wives, to be mothers, to manage a home. And in managing church resources today, in managing our own personal resources, deciding what to give to, what not to give to, we face the very same challenges that Paul did. Like him, we want to first of all identify a need. We want to find the widows amongst us, literally or metaphorically speaking. We want to identify needs. But then also, we want to identify who are genuine needs. What presents a worthy cause to give to, as opposed to enabling an unhealthy situation. Like these widows who were just becoming lazy. Paul said, we don't want to support that. That's no good. These widows need to find a different way, a more healthy way, become married, become part of families. And so again, we want to help, but we don't want to enable unhealthy situations, unhealthy behaviors. And so we want to support someone who is in need, but we don't want to be supporting someone in need only because they're being lazy, they're being irresponsible. We don't want to support a situation like that. Only because, as Paul puts it, they're being idle and literally or metaphorically speaking, kind of wandering from house to house, being a busybody, being irresponsible. We don't want to support people who are focused and preoccupied and minding things they shouldn't be, while failing to be focused on what they should be. And that's a challenge for our church board. It's a challenge for all of us to be generous, to give, but in doing so to genuinely help people and not enable people. To genuinely help people and not enable people. And so, I want to land right there. I run out of time, but I didn't run out of chapter. I hope to finish chapter 5 today, but we'll save that for next week. So I don't know. I hope there was something in there you could glean from, and just something to take with you that'll be a blessing, that'll be a help. Why don't we end with a song, and we'll wrap up.